Charleston's slave auctions of 1847 processed over 3,000 transactions that year, each meticulously recorded in leather-bound ledgers still housed in the South Carolina Historical Society archives. But one sale conducted on April 14th by auctioneer Samuel Pritchard contains an irregularity that 3 separate researchers have noted over the decades. The physical description doesn't match the gender designation. The buyer's signature shows signs of having been traced over, and the bill of sale was amended twice in different ink colors. What makes this transaction truly disturbing isn't just the paperwork. It's what happened 8 months later at Riverwood Plantation in Hanover County, Virginia, when a physician named Dr. Howard Kemp filed a private report with the county magistrate, then immediately left the state and never practiced medicine again. The report was sealed by court order and has never been made public until now. The full story of what happened at Riverwood has remained buried in private family letters, slave testimony recorded during a closed tribunal, and the cryptic diary entries of a woman who took her own life rather than face what her husband had planned for her. Before we continue with the story of Riverwood Plantation and the transaction that destroyed everyone it touched, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because stories like this one drawn from historical records that have been deliberately obscured need to be told. And I want to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment telling me what state or city you're in. Are you watching from Virginia, where this happened? From South Carolina, where it began? Let me know. Now, let's go back to where it all started. The spring of 1847 found Hanover County, Virginia, in a state of cautious prosperity. Located just north of Richmond, the county had weathered the economic fluctuations of the 1840s better than most, its rich soil producing tobacco that commanded premium prices in both domestic and European markets. The James River wound through the landscape, providing transportation for hogsheads of cured leaf that would make their way to Richmond's warehouses, and then to the world beyond. Riverwood Plantation occupied nearly 800 acres of this prime land, its borders marked by aging oak trees that had witnessed a century of cultivation. The main house, built in 1798 by the Vanderhost family, stood 3 stories tall with white columns that had weathered to a grayish cream. 12 windows faced south to catch the winter sun, and a wide porch wrapped around 2 sides of the structure, offering views of the tobacco fields that generated the family's wealth. By 1847, Riverwood belonged to Isaiah Vanderhorst, age 43, who had inherited the estate from his father in 1839. Isaiah cut an imposing figure in Hanover County society, standing over 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders of a man who had worked alongside his field hands in his youth, before prosperity and social expectations made such labor unseemly for a man of his station. His dark hair had begun to gray at the temples, and he maintained the mutton chop sideburns fashionable among Virginia gentlemen of the era. But those who knew him well noticed something had changed in recent years. His eyes, once bright with ambition, had taken on a haunted quality since his first wife's death in 1844. Sarah Vanderhorst had died of puerperal fever 5 days after delivering their 3rd stillborn child. Isaiah never spoke of her, but household slaves whispered that he kept her bedroom exactly as she'd left it, her hairbrush still on the vanity, her last needlework still stretched in its frame. The loss had done something to him. He'd always been a stern master, but never cruel by the standards of the time. After Sarah's death, something harder settled into his character, a brittleness that made even his most trusted slaves nervous. The plantation operated with a workforce of 43 enslaved people, ranging from field hands to the house staff that maintained the main residence. Among them was an elderly woman named Patience, who had served as Sarah's personal maid, and now managed the household with quiet efficiency. She'd been born at Riverwood and had known Isaiah since he was a boy. If anyone understood the change in him, it was Patience, though she kept her observations to herself. Isaiah's younger brother Thomas lived in Richmond and managed the business aspects of Riverwood's tobacco sales. At 38, Thomas was everything Isaiah was not: gregarious, charming, comfortable in the drawing rooms of Richmond society. Where Isaiah had married for love, Thomas had remained a bachelor, much to his mother's distress. The brothers maintained a cordial but distant relationship, meeting quarterly to discuss plantation finances and little else. By early 1847, family pressure and practical necessity had convinced Isaiah to remarry. At 43, with no heirs, he needed sons to secure Riverwood's future. His mother, Constance Vanderhorst, had taken matters into her own hands, corresponding with old friends across Virginia to identify suitable candidates. The woman she settled on was Catherine Shelby, daughter of a once prominent family from Albemarle County, whose fortunes had declined precipitously after her father's death in 1843. Catherine was 26, considered dangerously close to spinsterhood by Virginia standards. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense, her features too strong, her frame too thin, her manner too reserved. But she was educated, having attended a female academy in Charlottesville, and she carried herself with the dignity expected of her class despite her family's reduced circumstances. Most importantly, she was healthy and of childbearing age, and her family was desperate enough to accept Isaiah's proposal without excessive negotiation over settlements. They married on March 16, 1847 in a small ceremony at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Hanover County. Catherine arrived at Riverwood with 2 trunks of belongings, and a lady's maid her mother had insisted she bring a free woman of color named Dinah, who had been with the Shelby family for a decade. Isaiah had been clear that Dinah would be paid a small wage and given a room in the house, but that Catherine should not expect to maintain all the pretensions of her former life. Money was to be spent on the plantation's operations, not on excess servants. The early weeks of their marriage passed in stilted formality. Isaiah was not unkind, but neither was he warm. Catherine understood her role to manage the household, to produce heirs, to maintain appearances in county society. She accepted this arrangement with the same quiet resignation that had characterized her agreement to the marriage itself. At night, Isaiah came to her room at irregular intervals, performing his marital duties with mechanical efficiency before returning to his own chambers. There was no tenderness, no conversation beyond practical necessities. Catherine found the isolation of Riverwood oppressive. In Albemarle County, her family's reduced circumstances had still allowed for social calls, church gatherings, occasional trips to Charlottesville. Here, she was 15 miles from the nearest neighbor of her own class, and Isaiah showed no interest in entertaining or accepting invitations. He spent his days riding between tobacco fields, reviewing accounts in his study, or sitting on the porch in the evenings, smoking and staring at nothing. The household staff, led by Patience, treated Catherine with careful respect, but little warmth. She was the new mistress, replacing a woman they had loved. They would serve her, but they would not offer the easy familiarity that had existed between Sarah and the house slaves. Catherine felt herself suspended in a strange limbo, married, but not companioned, mistress, but not welcomed, living in a house that felt more like a prison than a home. It was Dinah who first suggested to Catherine that she might need additional help. Dinah at 45 was no longer as spry as she once was, and the management of Catherine's wardrobe, the care of her rooms and attendance to her personal needs left other household tasks unmanaged. Catherine mentioned this to Isaiah over dinner one evening in late March, carefully framing it as a practical matter, rather than a request for indulgence. Isaiah had been resistant at first. The household had sufficient staff, but Catherine, showing a hint of the steel beneath her reserved exterior, pointed out that the house slaves had their established routines and were answerable to Patience, not to her. If she was to properly manage the household as his wife, she needed someone answerable directly to her, someone to handle tasks that Dinah, as a paid employee, should not be expected to perform. After several days of consideration, Isaiah agreed. He would purchase a young house slave at the next opportunity, someone who could be trained to Catherine's specific requirements. That opportunity came sooner than expected. Thomas sent word from Richmond that he would be traveling to Charleston on business in early April, and could attend the slave auctions on Isaiah's behalf, if given parameters and funds. Isaiah provided both, a healthy female between 15 and 25, strong enough for household labor, but refined enough in manner to serve a lady literate if possible, and costing no more than 800. What neither Isaiah nor Thomas understood was that Charleston slave markets in the 1840s had become increasingly sophisticated in their deceptions. With slave prices rising and demand outstripping supply in certain categories, unscrupulous dealers had learned to manipulate appearances, forge documentation, and exploit buyers' assumptions to maximize profits. A young male slave might be dressed in women's clothing and presented as female if female domestic servants commanded higher prices. A field hand might be taught a few phrases of French and sold as a trained lady's maid. Bills of sale could be altered. Ages could be misrepresented. Medical conditions could be concealed. Thomas Vanderhorst, despite his Richmond sophistication, was not an experienced slave buyer. He attended the auction at Ryan's Mart on Chalmers Street, a 3-story building where hundreds of enslaved people were bought and sold each month. The auction of April 14th was particularly crowded, with buyers from across the South competing for prime merchandise. Thomas arrived with Isaiah's specifications clearly in mind, and his brother's money in his pocket, determined to make a good purchase. The auction hall smelled of unwashed bodies, tobacco smoke, and the particular anxiety that permeates places where human beings are sold like livestock. Thomas positioned himself in the middle of the crowd, neither too eager at the front, nor too disinterested at the back. He'd attended 2 other auctions in Richmond and knew the basic protocols, but Charleston's Ryan's Mart operated on a scale he found overwhelming. The auctioneer, Samuel Pritchard, was a heavy-set man with a voice like gravel, who worked through the lots with practiced efficiency. The first dozen sales were field hands, strong men in their 20s, destined for the rice plantations of the Low Country. Thomas paid little attention until Pritchard announced a change in merchandise. "Now, gentlemen, we turn to domestic servants. First up, lot number 47. A healthy female of approximately 17 years, trained in household duties, name of Grace." A figure was led onto the platform by one of Pritchard's assistants. Thomas leaned forward with interest. The individual who stood there was slight of build, perhaps 5't and 4 in, with skin the color of polished teak and features that could charitably be called delicate. She wore a simple cotton dress of faded blue, mended in several places, and kept her eyes downcast as Pritchard began his description. Grace comes from the estate of the late Mrs. Henrietta Gadsden, where she served as a lady's maid for 3 years. She's literate, having been taught her letters by Mrs. Gadsden herself, a Christian woman of good character. Note the refinement of her hands, gentlemen. These are not the hands of a field worker. She has experience with laundering, mending, hairdressing, and household management, a rare find for any gentleman seeking quality service for his wife or daughters. Thomas studied the figure on the platform more carefully. Grace's hair was wrapped in a tiny, the traditional head covering worn by women of color in Charleston. Her posture was submissive, shoulders slightly hunched, hands clasped at her waist. When Pritchard instructed her to turn around, she did so with small, careful steps. The dress, though worn, had been cut to fit a female form, and her movement suggested someone accustomed to domestic service rather than field labor. "Can she speak?" someone called from the crowd. Pritchard gestured for Grace to respond. "Yes, master," she said softly, her voice high and somewhat breathless. "I can speak and I can read the Bible and cipher numbers. What household tasks can you perform?" Thomas asked, speaking up for the first time. Grace kept her eyes lowered. "I can dress a lady's hair in the current fashion, master. I can maintain a wardrobe, clean and press garments, prepare medicinal teas, assist with correspondence, and manage household linens. Gadsden trained me carefully before her passing." The accent was Low Country Charleston, the grammar surprisingly correct for someone enslaved. Thomas felt his interest growing. This was exactly what Isaiah had specified, refined enough for Catherine's service, literate, trained in household arts. The fact that she came from a respectable estate rather than the rougher trade added to her value. "Any health issues?" another bidder asked. Pritchard shook his head vigorously. sound in body and mind. Dr. Marcus Waverly examined her 2 days ago. His certification is included in the documentation. No signs of consumption, dropsy, or female complaints. She's menstruated regularly according to the estate inventory. That last detail made Thomas slightly uncomfortable, but he understood it was relevant information for breeding potential, should a buyer wish to consider that aspect. He had no such intentions on Isaiah's behalf. This was strictly a domestic purchase, but the confirmation of good health was important. The bidding opened at $400. Thomas waited, watching as 2 other buyers pushed the price upward. At $650, one dropped out. At $725, the other hesitated. Thomas jumped in decisively. $750. A pause. The other bidder looked at Grace again, seemed to reconsider, then shook his head and stepped back. Pritchard's gavel came down. Sold to the gentleman in the gray coat for $750. See the clerk for documentation. Thomas made his way to the wooden table where a clerk processed the sales. As he waited, he watched Grace being led down from the platform. She moved carefully, keeping her eyes down, her gait somewhat awkward in a way he attributed to the nervousness of being sold. It didn't occur to him that she might be deliberately walking differently than came naturally. The paperwork took 20 minutes. The clerk filled out a bill of sale describing Grace as a Negro female of approximately 17 years, sound in body, literate, trained in domestic service. Thomas paid with a combination of cash and a draft on his Richmond bank, receiving a receipt and the transfer documents. Included in the papers was a brief letter from the Gadsden estate executive confirming Grace's provenance and training. What Thomas didn't notice, because he had no reason to look closely, was that the ink color of Grace's gender designation appeared slightly different from the rest of the text, as if it had been added later. He also didn't notice that Dr. Waverly's signature on the health certificate looked traced rather than original. These were sophisticated forgeries, the work of someone who understood that buyers rarely scrutinized documents closely when the merchandise matched their expectations. Thomas arranged for Grace to be held at the auction house until the next morning, when they would begin the journey to Virginia. He spent the evening at a hotel near the waterfront composing a letter to Isaiah informing him of the successful purchase and detailing Grace's apparent qualifications. "She seems a sensible creature," he wrote, "well-spoken and trained in precisely the arts Catherine will require. The price was somewhat higher than you specified, but I judged her quality worth the additional $50. The next morning, Thomas collected Grace from Ryan's Mart. She had been given a bundle containing her few possessions, an extra dress, undergarments, a comb, and a small Bible. She followed Thomas to the coach station without speaking, keeping several paces behind him as expected. They would travel by coach to Wilmington, then by packet boat up the coast to Richmond, and finally by hired carriage to Hanover County, a journey of approximately 5 days. During the journey, Thomas observed Grace carefully, as any prudent buyer would. She was quiet, speaking only when addressed, and showed appropriate deference. She ate sparingly at meal times, and slept sitting upright in the Negro sections of the coach stations where they stopped. Her manners were indeed refined, and she seemed intelligent in the careful way she observed her surroundings. Thomas felt confident Isaiah would be pleased with the purchase. What Thomas didn't know, because Grace never allowed herself to be seen in any state of undress, was that beneath the carefully constructed feminine appearance lay a biological reality quite different from what the bill of sale claimed. Grace had been born with ambiguous genitalia, a condition that occurred perhaps once in every 2,000 births. Her mother, a house slave named Ruth, on a plantation near Georgetown, South Carolina, had recognized immediately that her child would face impossible choices in a world that demanded clear categorization. Ruth had made her decision in the birthing room, telling the midwife that her baby was a girl. She had raised Grace as female from the first moment, choosing a name that could never be questioned, dressing her in girls' clothing, teaching her to move and speak and carry herself as women did. It had not been easy. As Grace grew, her body developed in ways that didn't entirely align with Ruth's chosen narrative. But Ruth was resourceful. Tight binding beneath layers of clothing concealed what needed to be concealed. Grace was kept away from situations where her body might be examined. She was trained exclusively in household tasks that would keep her in the main house, away from the communal living quarters where other slaves might discover her secret. The strategy had worked for 17 years. Grace had learned to navigate the world as female, and by adolescence, she had internalized the role so completely that it felt natural. Her voice remained high, partly from practice, and partly from her body's own ambiguous development. Her face never developed a beard. Her build remained slight. To casual observers, she was simply a delicate young woman, perhaps unusually tall and thin, but nothing that raised serious questions. Then Ruth had died of fever in 1845, and Grace had become part of the Gadsden household through an estate sale. Mrs. Henrietta Gadsden, elderly and nearly blind, had accepted Grace at face value, and had indeed trained her in the refined household arts Pritchard had advertised. When Mrs. Gadsden died in 1847, Grace became part of another estate sale. But this time the executive had been less scrupulous than honest, and a side arrangement with Samuel Pritchard had resulted in Grace's documentation being clarified in ways that would maximize her sale price. Grace knew she was living on borrowed time. Eventually someone would discover the truth. But for now, she played the role she'd been assigned since birth, following Thomas Vanderhorst to an uncertain future in Virginia, hoping that whatever awaited her at Riverwood Plantation might offer at least a temporary reprieve from discovery. They arrived at Riverwood on April 22nd, a humid afternoon with thunderclouds building in the western sky. Isaiah met them on the front porch, his expression neutral as he examined the purchase. Grace stood with her bundle at her feet, eyes downcast, saying nothing. "She seems suitable," Isaiah said. After a long moment, "Catherine can assess her capabilities. Patience. Take her to the house and get her settled. She'll room in the attic with the other house servants." Patience. Her face carefully blank, gestured for Grace to follow. As they walked toward the servants' entrance, Grace allowed herself one quick glance at the plantation house that would be her new prison. It looked solid, permanent, inescapable, exactly like every other place she'd ever lived. Catherine met her new servant the following morning in the small sitting room adjacent to her bedroom. Danina had already briefed Catherine on Grace's arrival, describing her as peculiar, quiet, even for a slave girl, and thin as a marsh reed. Now Catherine sat in a straight-backed chair, while Grace stood before her, hands clasped, eyes respectfully lowered. "Diner tells me you were trained in Charleston," Catherine began, her voice neither warm nor cold, simply business-like. "Can you dress hair?" "Yes, mistress. I know several fashions and I can use hot irons for curling." Catherine gestured toward her dressing table. "Show me." For the next 20 minutes, Grace worked with Catherine's dark brown hair, demonstrating techniques she'd learned from Mrs. Gadsden. Her hands were gentle but confident, arranging Catherine's hair into a style suitable for an afternoon at home. Catherine watched in the mirror, saying nothing, evaluating not just the skill, but the demeanor. What Catherine noticed first was how carefully Grace moved, as if always conscious of taking up minimal space. Her gestures were economical, her footsteps nearly silent, her breathing so quiet as to be almost imperceptible. There was something almost theatrical about her femininity, as if she'd studied the role rather than simply inhabiting it naturally. But Catherine, who had her own experience of performing expected roles, didn't find this particularly remarkable. Many slaves learned to present exaggerated versions of what their masters expected. "That will do," Catherine said when Grace finished. "You'll assist Diner with my wardrobe and personal needs. You'll help with household mending and preservation of linens. You'll attend me during social calls when they occur, though I understand those are rare here. You'll sleep in the attic with the other house servants. Your meals will be taken in the kitchen. Do you understand?" "Yes, mistress." "Thank you, mistress. One more thing." Catherine's voice dropped slightly. "My husband has moods. When he's in one of his dark periods, stay out of his sight unless specifically summoned. It's not personal, but he prefers minimal disruption when he's troubled." Can you do that? Grace nodded, and for just a moment, she raised her eyes enough to meet Catherine's in the mirror. What passed between them in that brief glance was recognition, one trapped person acknowledging another. Then Grace's eyes dropped again, and the moment passed. The first weeks of Grace's service at Riverwood established a routine that would govern the household through the spring and early summer of 1847. She rose before dawn, helping to light fires in the main house fireplaces, even though spring warmth made them less necessary. She assisted Catherine with dressing, often working alongside Dina to manage the complicated undergarments, corsets, and layered clothing that defined a Virginia lady's proper appearance. She proved skillful with a needle, repairing the delicate embroidery on Catherine's better dresses and mending torn lace with tiny, nearly invisible stitches. But it was in the quiet hours, the times when Catherine sat alone in her room reading or attempting needlework of her own, that the relationship between mistress and servant began to shift into something less defined by the strict hierarchies of the plantation system. At first, it was simply that Grace had a quality of stillness that Catherine found soothing. Unlike Dinah, who maintained a constant low commentary on household matters, Grace spoke only when necessary. She could sit for an hour mending shirts while Catherine read, the only sounds the ticking of the mantel clock and the whisper of thread through fabric. Then Catherine discovered that Grace could indeed read, and that her literacy extended beyond the basic Bible verses most educated slaves knew. One afternoon in early May, Catherine left a book open on her side table, a novel by Walter Scott that she'd been finding rather tedious. When she'd returned from a walk in the garden, she found Grace standing near the table, her eyes fixed on the open pages, her lips moving slightly as she silently read. "You like stories?" Catherine asked, not unkindly. Grace, startled, immediately dropping into a deferential posture. "I apologize, mistress. I shouldn't have looked. I asked if you like stories. It's a simple question." "Yes, mistress. Mrs. Gadsden used to let me read to her when her eyes got weak. She said I had a pleasant voice for it." Catherine considered this. The isolation at Riverwood had begun to weigh on her more heavily as spring turned toward summer. Isaiah showed no interest in her company beyond his occasional nocturnal visits. Denina was kind but practical, not given to the sort of conversation Catherine craved. The idea of having someone read aloud, filling the silent hours with words and narratives, held considerable appeal. "Every afternoon at 3000, when I take my rest, you'll read to me," Catherine announced. "We'll start with this Scott novel, though I warn you, it's rather dull. Afterwards, we'll find something better in Isaiah's library." This became their ritual. Every afternoon, while Catherine reclined on her daybed and the Virginia heat pressed against the windows, Grace sat in a straight-back chair and read aloud. They worked through the Scott novel, then moved on to Shakespeare's comedies, which Grace read with surprising expression, giving each character a distinct voice. Catherine found herself looking forward to these sessions, and gradually she began to talk during them, interrupting the reading to comment on a passage or share a memory prompted by the text. Grace, for her part, learned to respond with more than simple acknowledgments. She offered observations about the characters, asked questions about words she didn't know, and occasionally made Catherine laugh with a dry comment about a particularly ridiculous plot development. The strict boundary between mistress and servant didn't disappear, but it became more permeable, at least in the privacy of Catherine's rooms. Dina noticed the change and worried about it. She pulled Catherine aside one morning in early June. "Mistress Catherine, I don't mean to speak out of turn, but you're getting mighty familiar with that Grace girl. It ain't proper, and it ain't wise. These Virginia people, they have particular notions about how things should be done." Catherine stiffened. "I'm the mistress of this house, Dinah. I'll manage my servants as I see fit." "Yes, ma'am, I know that. But Mr. Isaiah, he's a particular sort of man, and this household, it's got his ways. I'm just saying be careful how things appear." Catherine dismissed the warning, but it lodged in her mind nonetheless. She told herself that her friendship, if it could be called that, with Grace was innocent, merely the natural result of isolation and shared interests. But she also became more careful about concealing the depth of their afternoon conversations from the rest of the household, instructing Grace to maintain a more distant demeanor when others were present. What Catherine didn't know, what no one in the household suspected, was that Grace lived in constant terror of discovery. The attic room she shared with two other house slaves, Lily and Hannah, required constant vigilance. Grace changed clothing only when absolutely necessary, and always with her back turned, citing modesty as a personal quirk the others eventually accepted. She bathed in the kitchen after everyone else had gone to bed, heating water herself and washing quickly by candlelight. She had learned to manage her body's less feminine functions through careful binding and strategic use of rags that she laundered privately and stored in her personal bundle. The monthly cycle that Pritchard had certified in Charleston did not exist, a fact Grace concealed through occasional claims of female troubles that required her to rest in her room for a day or two each month. The other house slaves accepted this without question. Such complaints were common enough among women. What they didn't see was Grace lying on her narrow bed during these times, binding herself even more tightly, praying that no one would demand proof of her claimed condition. By late June, something else had begun to develop between Catherine and Grace, something neither woman fully acknowledged even to herself. It started with small gestures, Grace's hand steadying Catherine's arm as she rose from her chair, lingering a moment longer than necessary. Catherine reaching out to tuck a stray wisp of Grace's hair back under her tynol, her fingers brushing the other woman's cheek, moments of eye contact that extended beyond what the servant-mistress relationship required. Catherine told herself it was simply gratitude for companionship in a lonely house. Grace told herself it was merely strategic, cultivating the favor of someone who could protect her if questions ever arose. But both women felt the charge in the air between them. The way their afternoon reading sessions had begun to feel like something intimate and forbidden, a secret world that existed only in that upstairs room with the door closed against the rest of Riverwood. It was Grace who first touched Catherine in a way that couldn't be misinterpreted as mere service. One afternoon in early July, Catherine had been crying quietly as Grace read from a volume of poetry. The verses were about lost love, and they had reminded Catherine of the life she'd imagined for herself before her father's death had forced her into this arranged marriage. Grace had stopped reading, setting the book aside, and then she had knelt beside Catherine's David and taken her hand. "I'm sorry for your sadness, mistress," Grace had said softly. And the way she'd said it, the genuine emotion in her voice had broken through Catherine's careful composure entirely. Catherine had gripped Grace's hand tightly, weeping openly, and Grace had stayed there, kneeling on the floor, holding Catherine's hand and saying nothing, just being present in the grief. Afterwards, neither woman mentioned the incident, but something had shifted irrevocably. The next afternoon, Catherine asked Grace to sit beside her on the David, rather than in the separate chair. Grace hesitated, understanding the implications, then complied. They read that way for weeks, sitting close enough that their shoulders occasionally touched. Catherine's hands sometimes resting on Grace's arm, Grace's voice soft and close. They never discussed what was happening between them. To name it would have made it real, and reality in Hanover County, Virginia in 1847 had no space for what they were becoming to each other. So they existed in deliberate denial, two women in an impossible situation, finding comfort in a connection that defied every rule of their world. Isaiah, occupied with the tobacco harvest and increasingly frequent business trips to Richmond, noticed nothing. Denina noticed everything but held her tongue, her worry deepening with each passing week. Patience, managing the household with her usual quiet efficiency, watched from a distance, and wondered what would come of two desperate souls clinging to each other in a house built on the suffering of others. By August, Catherine had stopped requesting Isaiah's presence in her bedroom. She claimed headaches, feminine indisposition, exhaustion from the heat. Isaiah, who had never seemed particularly interested in her company beyond his duty to produce an heir, accepted these excuses readily. His nocturnal visits ceased and Catherine felt nothing but relief. In September, everything changed. The first indication that something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning in mid-September, when Catherine fainted during breakfast. Isaiah had been reading the Richmond newspaper and barely noticed when she stood abruptly, her face pale, one hand pressed to her stomach. She managed 3 steps toward the door before her legs gave out. Diner serving at the sideboard caught her before she hit the floor. "Get her upstairs," Isaiah ordered, setting down his paper with irritation, "and send for Dr. Kemp." Dr. Howard Kemp was a young physician, only 31, who had established his practice in Hanover County 2 years earlier, after completing his medical training in Philadelphia. He arrived at Riverwood within 2 hours, his medical bag in hand, his manner professionally composed despite the nervous energy that always seemed to hover around him like a visible aura. Catherine had been settled in her bed with Danina and Grace attending her. She was conscious but still pale, complaining of nausea and dizziness. Dr. Kemp performed a basic examination while the 2 servants waited outside the room, then called Isaiah in for a private consultation. "I believe congratulations are in order, Mr. Vanderhorst," Dr. Kemp said, unable to entirely suppress a smile. "Your wife shows every sign of being with child. The nausea, the fainting, the exhaustion she's mentioned, these are all consistent with early pregnancy. I'd estimate she's approximately 6 to 8 weeks along." Isaiah stood very still for a long moment. "You're certain?" "As certain as one can be at this early stage. Of course, we'll know more definitively in the coming weeks, but I see no reason to doubt it. Mrs. Vanderhoor is young and appears healthy. With proper care and rest, there's every reason to expect a successful outcome." After Dr. Kemp left, Isaiah stood on the front porch for over an hour, smoking his pipe and staring at the tobacco fields. His expression revealed nothing of what he was thinking. When he finally went back inside, he instructed patients to inform Catherine that he was pleased about the pregnancy, and that she should rest as much as necessary. He did not go to see her himself. What Isaiah did do that evening in the privacy of his study was sit down with his personal diary and count backwards from mid-September. His last visit to Catherine's bedroom had been in mid-July, nearly 2 months ago. Before that, there had been a gap of several weeks due to his business travels. The arithmetic didn't seem quite right, but Isaiah was not a medical man, and he told himself that Dr. Kemp surely knew better than he did about such matters. Still, something nagged at him, a discomfort he couldn't quite name. He'd been married to Sarah for 9 years before her death, and she'd conceived 3 times. He remembered her pregnancies, the timing, the symptoms. This felt different somehow, though he couldn't articulate why. Catherine, for her part, lay in her bed in a state of shock that she concealed from everyone except Grace. When they were alone that evening, Catherine finally spoke the words that had been echoing in her mind since Dr. Kemp's diagnosis. "This isn't possible," she whispered. "Isaiah hasn't. We haven't. Not since July, and only once then. It's been months before that." Grace sat on the edge of the bed, her face carefully composed. Dr. Kemp seemed certain. "Mistress, I know my own body, Grace. I know when that happens, and it hasn't happened enough for this." Catherine's hand moved to her stomach, her expression bewildered. "How can I be pregnant?" Grace said nothing, but her silence had a quality to it that made Catherine look at her sharply. For a moment, something passed between them, a flicker of understanding too dangerous to speak aloud. Then Grace looked away and the moment dissolved. "Perhaps the doctor knows best," Grace said quietly. "Perhaps it's possible, even with less frequent relations." Catherine wanted to push further to demand that Grace help her make sense of this impossibility, but exhaustion overwhelmed her. She let herself sink back into the pillows, closing her eyes. Grace remained sitting on the bed, one hand resting near Catherine's arm, not quite touching, but close enough to offer comfort. Over the next weeks, Catherine's pregnancy progressed with textbook normally. The morning sickness intensified, then gradually faded. Her body began to change in small but unmistakable ways. Dr. Kemp visited twice more, pronouncing himself satisfied with her condition and predicting a birth in late April or early May. Isaiah received this news with what appeared to be quiet satisfaction, though those who knew him well noticed he spent more time than usual in his study, poring over account books with unusual intensity. Thomas visited from Richmond in October and found his brother distant, preoccupied, responding to questions about the tobacco harvest with uncharacteristic brevity. "You should be celebrating," Thomas said over dinner one evening. "After everything, a child at last, this is what you wanted." Isaiah nodded slowly, cutting his meat with methodical precision. "Yes, of course. Catherine seems healthy enough. Dr. Kemp is competent. There's no reason to worry." "I'm not worried," Isaiah replied, but his tone suggested otherwise. Thomas left the next day, troubled by his brother's mood, but attributing it to the natural anxiety of a man who had lost 3 children before they could draw breath. He didn't know that Isaiah had begun asking careful questions of patients, of Dina, of the other house servants, questions about Catherine's daily routines, about who attended her, about how she spent her time. The answers he received were unremarkable. Mrs. Vanderhorst rested frequently, as pregnant women should. She took light walks in the garden. She read in her room during the afternoon hours. Grace and Dinah attended her. She had no visitors and requested none. Her behavior was entirely appropriate for a woman in her condition. What no one told Isaiah, because no one thought it significant, was exactly how much time Catherine spent alone with Grace during those afternoon hours. Or that the door to Catherine's sitting room remained closed for 2 or 3 hours each day. Or that Grace had begun sleeping on a pallet in Catherine's dressing room, rather than in the attic with the other house slaves, supposedly so she could attend Catherine quickly if morning sickness struck during the night. This arrangement had been Catherine's idea, proposed in late September and implemented over Dinah's quiet objections. Catherine had claimed it was practical, necessary given her condition. In truth, it was motivated by a need that had nothing to do with medical necessity, and everything to do with the relationship that had deepened between mistress and servant into something neither woman could any longer pretend to misunderstand. They had become lovers, though neither used that word. It had happened gradually through September, small transgressions that accumulated into larger ones. Grace's hand moving from Catherine's arm to her face, Catherine pulling Grace closer on the daybed until they were lying together. The first kiss that had shocked them both with its intensity. They told themselves they were offering each other comfort, companionship, relief from loneliness, but they both knew it was more than that. Grace lived in constant terror that her body would betray her, that Catherine would discover the anatomical reality beneath the feminine performance. But Catherine never pushed for intimacies that would have revealed the truth. Their physical relationship remained constrained by layers of clothing, by darkness, by careful positioning that Grace orchestrated with desperate subtlety. Catherine seemed content with what Grace offered. Or perhaps she deliberately chose not to question the boundaries Grace maintained. What Catherine had not questioned in those early weeks of their intimacy in late August was whether pregnancy could result from their encounters. She was educated enough to know that conception required specific biological circumstances, but she had been taught, like most women of her class, that the details were shameful and not to be examined too closely. She knew pregnancy came from relations with men. What had happened between her and Grace didn't fit that category in her understanding, so she hadn't considered the possibility. Now, carrying a child whose existence she couldn't rationally explain, Catherine found herself caught between denying reality and accepting an impossibility. She never asked Grace directly whether her servant might be something other than what she appeared. To ask would be to shatter the careful fiction they'd constructed, and Catherine needed that fiction more than she needed truth. Grace, meanwhile, lived in absolute terror. She had known, of course, that their intimacy could lead to this outcome. She had tried to be careful, but desire and desperation had made her reckless. Now, Catherine was pregnant, and it was only a matter of time before someone started asking questions that would lead inevitably to Grace's exposure and destruction. She considered running. The Underground Railroad had routes through Virginia, and she'd heard whispered rumors of sympathetic people who helped escaped slaves reach the North. But running would require leaving Catherine, and Grace found she couldn't bear that thought. Moreover, running would draw immediate attention and investigation. As long as she remained at Riverwood playing her role, there was at least a chance that the pregnancy would be attributed to Isaiah, and no one would look deeper. So, Grace stayed, attending Catherine through her pregnancy, sleeping on the pallet in the dressing room, continuing their afternoon reading sessions that had become cover for stolen moments of connection, and she waited for discovery with the fatalism of someone who had always known this day would come. October brought cooler weather and the first real chill to Isaiah's behavior. He had begun watching Catherine with an intensity that made her deeply uncomfortable. At meals, she would look up to find his eyes fixed on her, his expression unreadable. He asked questions about how she felt when the baby moved, what Dr. Kemp had said during his visits. The questions seemed innocuous on the surface, but Catherine sensed something calculating beneath them. Dina felt it too. She pulled Catherine aside one morning in late October. "Mistress, Mr. Isaiah has been asking me questions about you, about your daily routines, about who attends you." "What kind of questions?" "Specific things. What time you wake, what time you rest, who brings your meals, how long Grace stays with you during the afternoons." Dinah's face was tight with worry. "I don't like the feel of it, mistress. It's like he's looking for something." Catherine felt ice settle in her stomach. "What did you tell him?" "Only what's proper to say. That you rest as you should. That Grace attends you as is right for your condition." "I didn't mention." Danina paused, choosing her words carefully. "I didn't mention anything that might cause trouble." "Thank you, Danina." "Mistress Catherine, I need to say something plain. I know you think I'm just a worrying old woman, but I've lived in Virginia my whole life, and I know how things work here. Whatever's happening between you and that Grace girl, it needs to stop. Mr. Isaiah is suspicious about something, and if he starts digging, people could get hurt. People could die." Catherine stiffened. "Nothing's happening that concerns my husband." "That's not what I said, and you know it. I said people could die, and I meant it. This isn't Albemarle County where your family had some protection. This is Isaiah Vanderhorst's plantation, and he's the law here. If he decides someone has wronged him." Danina didn't finish the sentence. That evening, Catherine lay in bed listening to Grace's quiet breathing from the pallet in the dressing room. She thought about Dina's warning, about Isaiah's questions, about the child growing inside her, that would be born with features that might or might not resemble the man who believed himself its father. She thought about what would happen when Isaiah's suspicions, whatever they were, crystallized into accusations. She should send Grace away. It was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. But Catherine had never been particularly sensible, and she'd long ago stopped caring about safety in the conventional sense. So instead of sending Grace away, she called her back into the bedroom. "Sleep here tonight," Catherine said quietly. "I don't want to be alone." Grace hesitated, understanding the risk, then carefully climbed into the bed. They lay facing each other in the darkness, not touching, just breathing the same air. After a long silence, Catherine spoke. "Whatever happens, I want you to know that these months have been the only time in my life I've felt truly seen by another person. The only time I've felt less alone. Mistress Catherine, when we're alone, call me Catherine." "Catherine," Grace said carefully, testing the name. "I feel the same way, and I'm sorry for all of it. For what's coming, what is coming." Grace was quiet for a long time. "Discovery. Eventually, it's inevitable. Then we'll face it together." But even as Catherine said it, she knew it was a hollow promise. They wouldn't face anything together because the world they lived in would never allow that. When discovery came, Catherine would be the wronged wife and Grace would be the deceiver. and nothing that had passed between them would matter in the face of those assigned roles. November brought the first serious complication. Catherine was 4 months along now, her pregnancy beginning to show despite the concealing layers of clothing fashionable for the time. Dr. Kemp visited for his monthly examination and pronounced himself satisfied with her progress, but he also mentioned something that made Catherine's blood run cold. "The baby is quite active," he noted, his hands pressed to her abdomen. "That's a good sign. Strong movement suggests vigor. I'd say you're carrying a boy, Mrs. Vanderhorst. They tend to be more active in the womb." After he left, Isaiah came to Catherine's room, something he rarely did anymore. He sat in the chair by her window, his face troubled. "Dr. Kemp says 4 months, Isaiah said slowly. "That would mean conception in July." Catherine forced herself to meet his eyes. "Yes, that seems right. I was gone most of July. Business in Richmond, you remember. I was only here for 3 days in the middle of the month." "Yes, you came to my room one of those nights." Catherine kept her voice steady. "One night." Isaiah's eyes were hard now. "Once, and Dr. Kemp is certain about 4 months. He's the physician. I assume he knows how to calculate these things." Isaiah stood walking to the window, his back to her. "Sarah conceived 3 times in 9 years. 3 times, Catherine, and I was with her regularly, far more than I've been with you. Yet you conceive after a handful of encounters, most of them months before we were even married. I don't understand what you're suggesting." He turned to face her, and Catherine saw something dangerous in his expression. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm simply noting facts. And facts, Catherine, have a way of revealing truth." Eventually, after he left, Catherine sat shaking for nearly an hour before Grace returned from an errand to find her in tears. Grace held her, saying nothing because there was nothing to say. They both understood that Isaiah's suspicions had moved from vague unease to specific doubt. The question was no longer whether he suspected something, but what he would do about it. The answer came sooner than either woman expected. In early December, Isaiah summoned Patience to his study. The conversation lasted over an hour, and when Patience emerged, her face was grave. She went directly to the kitchen and spoke in low tones with the cook, then disappeared into the slave quarters. Within a day, rumors began circulating among the enslaved workers at Riverwood. The master was asking questions, specific questions about Mrs. Vanderhorst and Grace, about their time together, about anything unusual anyone might have observed. The house slaves, loyal to Patience and protective of their own precarious positions, said nothing of substance. But the questions themselves were enough to create an atmosphere of tension that pervaded the entire plantation. Just when it seemed the situation couldn't become more fraught, something happened that pushed events toward an inevitable crisis. Isaiah received a letter from Thomas in Richmond, a letter that would later become Exhibit C in the sealed tribunal documents. Thomas had been making inquiries in Charleston, following up on some business matters. While there, he'd happened to meet Samuel Pritchard in a tavern. They'd shared a drink, discussed the slave trade, and Thomas had mentioned the purchase he'd made on Isaiah's behalf back in April. Pritchard had seemed uneasy at the mention of Grace, had changed the subject quickly, and Thomas, ever observant in social situations, had noticed the reaction. Curious, Thomas had done some quiet investigating. He'd spoken to the clerk who had processed the sale. He'd examined his copy of the bill of sale more carefully, noticing for the first time the slight variation in ink color on certain portions of the document. He tried to find Dr. Marcus Waverly, whose signature appeared on the health certificate, only to discover that no physician by that name practiced in Charleston. Thomas's letter to Isaiah was carefully worded, but the implications were clear. Something about Grace's sale had been irregular. The documentation might have been falsified. The health certificate was definitely forged, and Pritchard, when pressed, had become defensive, and eventually admitted that sometimes gender designations had to be clarified for market purposes, a phrase Thomas found disturbingly ambiguous. Isaiah read the letter 3 times, his face growing darker with each reading. Then he locked it in his desk drawer and sat in his study for the rest of the afternoon, drinking whiskey and thinking about his wife's impossible pregnancy, about Grace's two delicate features, about the closed door of Catherine's sitting room during those long afternoon hours. By evening he had made his decision. He would know the truth, whatever it took to discover it. And if the truth was what he increasingly suspected, then he would ensure that everyone involved paid an appropriate price for making a fool of Isaiah Vanderhorst. The next morning, he sent a message to Dr. Kemp. The physician was needed at Riverwood immediately for an urgent medical matter. Not Catherine. The pregnancy was proceeding normally. This concerned one of the house slaves, Grace. A thorough examination was required. When Grace received the summons, she knew immediately what it meant. Discovery had come at last. Dr. Kemp arrived at Riverwood on a Thursday morning, December 11, 1847. The sky was low and gray, threatening snow that wouldn't fall until evening. He was shown into Isaiah's study, where the master of Riverwood sat behind his desk, with Thomas's letter laid open before him. "Thank you for coming so quickly," Isaiah said, his voice carefully controlled. "I have a situation that requires your professional discretion." Dr. Kemp, sensing the tension in the room, sat in the offered chair and waited. "I need you to examine one of my slaves. Grace, she's been attending my wife during her pregnancy, and I've become concerned about certain irregularities." Isaiah chose his words carefully. "I need a complete medical examination, thorough and definitive. I need to know exactly what I'm dealing with. I don't understand. Has she shown signs of illness? I need you to confirm her sex," Isaiah said bluntly. "I have reason to believe the documentation from her sale may have been falsified." Kemp's expression shifted to one of discomfort. "Mr. Vanderhorst, that's a highly unusual request. If you suspect fraud in the sale, that's a legal matter, not a medical one. It becomes a medical matter when it concerns my wife's pregnancy." Isaiah's voice had hardened. 4 months along, conceived during a period when I was rarely present, attended daily by a slave whose provenance is now questionable. I'm sure you can see why I might want clarity on this matter. The implications hung heavy in the air between them. Dr. Kemp's face palled slightly as he worked through what Isaiah was suggesting. "I see. And if the examination reveals what you suspect, then I'll know the full extent of the deception, and I can proceed accordingly." Dr. Kemp was not a courageous man, but he was fundamentally decent, and the direction this conversation was heading troubled him deeply. "Mr. Vanderhorst, even if your suspicions about the slave prove correct, that doesn't necessarily mean what you're implying. Your wife is a lady of good character. Whatever irregularity might exist in the slave's documentation, I'm sure there's an innocent explanation that doesn't involve Dr." Isaiah's voice cut through the protest. "I'm not asking for your opinions about my wife's character. I'm asking for a medical examination of a slave I own. Will you do it or not?" After a long pause, Dr. Kemp nodded slowly. He was a physician who depended on wealthy planters like Isaiah for his livelihood. Refusing such a request would have professional consequences he couldn't afford. "I'll conduct the examination. Where is the slave now?" Grace was summoned to a small room on the first floor that had once served as Sarah Vanderhost's sewing room. Isaiah had cleared it of furniture, except for a simple table and 2 chairs. Patience brought Grace to the door, her face full of terrible sympathy, then withdrew. Isaiah and Dr. Kemp entered, closing the door behind them. Grace stood in the center of the room, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes downcast. She knew what was coming. She'd known since the moment she'd received the summons that her careful performance had finally reached its end. Part of her felt almost relieved. The strain of maintaining the deception had been exhausting, and now at least it would be over one way or another. "Grace," Isaiah said, his voice cold and formal, "Dr. Kemp is going to examine you. You will cooperate fully, do you understand?" "Yes, master." "Remove your clothing." Grace looked up then, meeting Isaiah's eyes for the first time. What he saw in her face wasn't fear exactly, but something more complex. Resignation mixed with a strange kind of dignity. She began to undress slowly, carefully folding each garment as she removed it, as if this small act of order could provide some control in a situation where she had none. Dr. Kemp turned away as Grace disrobed, focusing his attention on preparing his medical instruments with unnecessary meticulousness. He was deeply uncomfortable with what he'd been asked to do, but he'd committed to the examination and would follow through professionally. When Grace stood naked before them, the truth of her body was undeniable. The careful binding she'd maintained beneath her clothing was gone, revealing anatomy that contradicted every assumption that had been made about her since Thomas had purchased her in Charleston. She was intersex with physical characteristics that didn't align neatly with typical male or female presentation, but included distinctly masculine anatomy alongside other more ambiguous features. Isaiah stared for a long moment, his face unreadable, then turned abruptly and walked to the window. "Make your examination thorough, doctor. I want documentation of every detail." Dr. Kemp approached Grace with visible reluctance. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, too low for Isaiah to hear. Then he began his examination, clinical and methodical, noting observations in a small leather journal he'd brought. Grace stood motionless throughout, her eyes fixed on a point on the far wall, her mind deliberately empty of thought or feeling. The examination took 20 minutes. When it was complete, Dr. Kemp allowed Grace to dress again, then turned to Isaiah with his journal in hand. "Your suspicions were correct," Kemp said, his voice flat. "The individual presents with what medical literature terms hermaphroditism. There are both masculine and ambiguous characteristics. The bill of sales description of a female was either an error or a deliberate misrepresentation." Isaiah's jaw tightened. "Is pregnancy possible? If this person were to have relations with a woman?" Dr. Kemp hesitated. The medical understanding of intersex conditions in 1847 was limited, but he knew enough to answer truthfully. "Based on what I have observed, yes, conception would be physiologically possible." Isaiah closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with new hardness. "Thank you, doctor. I'll need you to provide written documentation of your findings, detailed and signed. Can you have it ready by tomorrow?" "Yes, but Mr. Vanderhorst, I must advise extreme caution in how you proceed." "This is a delicate matter that I know exactly how to proceed," Isaiah interrupted. "You've confirmed what I needed to know. The rest is my concern." After Dr. Kemp left, Isaiah stood in the sewing room with Grace for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice shook with controlled rage. "How long?" Grace said nothing. "How long have you been deceiving my wife? How long have you been in her bed playing the role of a woman while fathering a child on her?" "She didn't know," Grace said quietly. "Catherine never knew what I was. I never told her." "You expect me to believe that? That my wife was so stupid, so blind that she didn't realize? I expect you to believe what's true. Catherine is innocent in this. She believed I was what I appeared to be. She believed the child was yours." Isaiah moved forward suddenly, his hands striking Grace across the face hard enough to knock her to the floor. "Don't speak my wife's name. You don't have that right." Grace stayed on the floor, tasting blood from a split lip, and said nothing more. There was nothing more to say. The truth was out, and now consequences would follow with the same inevitability that had brought her to this moment. Isaiah left the room, locking the door behind him. Grace sat on the floor for a long time, until eventually patience came with a lantern after darkness had fallen. The old woman didn't speak as she helped Grace to her feet and led her not to the main house, but to a storage shed behind the slave quarters where farm equipment was kept inside. Someone had placed a bucket of water, a blanket, and a heel of bread. "Mr. Isaiah says you're to stay here until he decides what to do," Patience said, her voice breaking slightly. "I'm sorry, child. I'm so sorry." She locked the shed door from the outside and Grace was left in darkness, knowing that her fate and Catherine's now rested entirely in the hands of a man who felt he'd been made a fool in his own house. Upstairs in the main house, Catherine knew nothing of the examination. She'd been kept deliberately unaware, told only that Grace had been needed for other duties that day. It wasn't until Dinah came to help her dress for dinner that Catherine learned something was terribly wrong. "Where's Grace?" Catherine asked, noting her absence. Dinah's hands shook as she fastened Catherine's dress. "Mistress, something's happened. Mr. Isaiah, he had Dr. Kemp examine Grace today, and now she's been locked in the equipment shed." Catherine went completely still. "Examined her? Why, I don't know the details, mistress, but the whole household is talking. Mr. Zaya has been shut in his study all afternoon, and Thomas arrived from Richmond an hour ago. They're in there together now, and from what the servants can hear, it's not good." Catherine felt the floor tilt beneath her. She gripped the back of a chair for support, her mind racing through implications she didn't want to face. "I need to see my husband." "Mistress, I don't think that's wise right now. He's in a state from what I hear. Maybe wait until now." "Dina, I need to see him now." But when Catherine knocked on Isaiah's study door, it was Thomas who answered. His face was grave as he looked at her, and she saw pity in his eyes, which was somehow worse than anger would have been. "Catherine, you should rest. You're carrying a child. This stress isn't good for your condition. I need to speak with my husband." "That's not possible right now. Isaiah is. He's working through some difficult information. It would be better if you gave him time." "What information? What happened to Grace?" Thomas glanced back into the study, then stepped into the hallway, pulling the door closed behind him. He lowered his voice. "Catherine, I don't know what's been happening in this house, but Isaiah has discovered something about the slave girl. It's complicated and serious. The best thing you can do is go to your room and let Isaiah handle this as he sees fit. Tell me what he discovered." "I can't. That's not my place. But I will tell you this. If you're involved in any way with what's happened here, you need to think very carefully about what you're going to say when Isaiah asks you questions, because he will ask and your answers need to be convincing." Catherine felt ice spread through her chest. She understood then that whatever Isaiah had learned, it was enough to shatter the careful fiction she and Grace had maintained. The pregnancy, Grace's identity, their relationship, all of it was about to be exposed in whatever form Isaiah chose to believe. She went back to her room, dismissed Dinah, and sat in the darkness as evening fell into night. She thought about Grace locked in the equipment shed. She thought about the child moving in her womb, innocent of the circumstances of its conception. She thought about Isaiah's rage and what forms it might take, and she made a decision. If Isaiah was going to destroy Grace for what had happened, he would have to destroy Catherine too. She would not allow the person she loved to face judgment alone, while she hid behind the protection of her class and her marriage. Whatever came, they would face it together, or Catherine would ensure that Isaiah's revenge consumed her as well. The confrontation came the next morning. Isaiah summoned Catherine to his study at 8:00 before she'd had breakfast, while morning sickness still made her stomach churn. Thomas was there again, standing by the window, and Dr. Kemp sat in a chair by the fireplace, looking profoundly uncomfortable. Isaiah stood behind his desk. Dr. Kemp's written report spread before him. When Catherine entered, he didn't ask her to sit. "I have some questions for you," Isaiah began, his voice dangerously quiet. "And I expect truthful answers. Do you understand?" Catherine raised her chin slightly. "I understand. How long have you been having relations with Grace?" The bluntness of the question was clearly intended to shock her into a revealing response. Catherine kept her face carefully neutral. "I don't know what you mean. Don't insult me with denials. Dr. Kemp has examined Grace. I know what she is, what he is, whatever term applies. I know that thing is not a woman, and I know that the child you're carrying is not mine." "How can you possibly know that?" Isaiah's control cracked slightly. "Because I was barely here when conception occurred. Because I've sired 3 dead children in 9 years with Sarah, and suddenly you conceive after a handful of encounters. Because that creature has been in your room alone with you for hours every day since arriving at this plantation." His voice had risen to a shout. Thomas stepped forward. "Isaiah, calm yourself. This isn't helping." But Isaiah ignored his brother, his eyes fixed on Catherine. "Tell me the truth. All of it, or I swear to God, Catherine, What I do to both of you will be talked about in Hanover County for the next 50 years. Catherine felt the baby move inside her, a small flutter that reminded her what was at stake. She could lie. She could claim innocence, say that Grace had deceived her as thoroughly as she'd deceived everyone else. Isaiah might believe it, or he might choose to believe it to avoid the scandal of having his wife publicly implicated in such a situation. That was the sensible path, the safe path. Instead, she told him the truth. "I love her," Catherine said quietly. "Him, whatever term you prefer. I love Grace, and yes, we were intimate. Though I didn't know until this moment that Grace was anything other than a woman. I thought the child was yours, because I didn't understand how else it could be possible. But if you're saying Grace is responsible, then yes, I believe you because I cannot otherwise explain this pregnancy." The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas stared at Catherine as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. Dr. Kemp looked at the floor, his face flushed. Isaiah stood frozen behind his desk, apparently shocked that she'd admitted it so boldly. "You're confessing to adultery," Isaiah finally said, "to sodomy, to crimes that could see you both executed if I brought this before a public court." "Yes," Catherine agreed. "I suppose I am. So, what will you do, Isaiah? Will you have us both hanged in the town square? Will you call the magistrate and show him Dr. Kemp's report? Will you stand before Hanover County Society and explain how your wife cuckolded you with someone you'd purchased as a female slave? How will that story end for your reputation?" Isaiah's face had gone white. "You think you're clever. You think I won't act because of scandal. I think you're trapped," Catherine said. And there was something almost like satisfaction in her voice. "You can't punish us without exposing yourself to humiliation. You can't claim the child as yours now. Not after having Dr. Kemp examine Grace and document what he found. But you also can't reject the child without explaining why. You're caught in the same impossible situation you've put us in." Thomas cleared his throat. "There may be a solution here that avoids the worst outcomes for everyone." "I'm not interested in solutions that protect them," Isaiah snarled. "Then you're a fool," Thomas shot back, his own temper finally showing. "Because Catherine is right. You're trapped by your own discovery. If this becomes public, you're ruined. The story will be that Isaiah Vanderhort was such an inadequate husband, that his wife preferred a slave of ambiguous gender over him. That's what people will say. And you know it. So unless you want to live with that for the rest of your life, you need to think strategically, not emotionally." Isaiah slumped into his chair, suddenly looking older than his 43 years. "What are you suggesting?" "A tribunal," Thomas said. "Private, composed of trusted men who can keep their mouths shut. They hear the evidence, make a judgment that satisfies the law, and then everyone involved disappears quietly. Catherine can be sent away to live with relatives. The child adopted out or placed in an orphanage. Grace sold south or worse. The story we tell publicly is that Catherine's health required her to leave Riverwood, and the pregnancy ended unfortunately. It's not ideal, but it's manageable." "And if I want them both dead?" Isaiah asked. "That's within my rights. Catherine for adultery, Grace for rape of a white woman." Catherine laughed bitterly. "Rape? Is that the story you'll tell? That I was forced? I've just confessed the opposite." "Your confession doesn't matter. The law will see it as rape regardless of what you claim." "Then do it," Catherine said, meeting his eyes directly. "Call the magistrate, have us arrested, put us on trial. Let everyone in Virginia know what happened in your house. I don't care anymore, Isaiah. I'd rather die honestly than live in this house one more day pretending to be something I'm not." Dr. Kemp finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Mr. Vanderhorst, I need to state clearly that I will not participate in any legal proceeding that results in execution. If you pursue that route, I'll refuse to provide my examination report as evidence. I'm a physician, not an executioner." Isaiah looked around the room at the three people who had in different ways betrayed or opposed him. His rage was still there, but it was being slowly smothered by the practical realization that he had very few good options. Thomas was right. Public exposure would destroy him as surely as it would destroy Catherine and Grace. A tribunal, he finally agreed. But I want that thing dead. I don't care how it happens or where, but Grace doesn't live beyond this winter. That's not negotiable. Thomas nodded slowly. I can arrange that. After the tribunal, Grace will be sold to a dealer who handles difficult merchandise. What happens after that is out of our hands, but I think you can safely assume the outcome will be what you want. And Catherine, that's your decision as her husband. But I'd suggest sending her to Mother in Charleston. The story is she needs coastal air for her health during the pregnancy. After the child is born, it can be placed with a family quietly, and Catherine can return here or not, depending on what you both decide. Isaiah looked at Catherine, and in his eyes she saw not love or even hatred, just exhaustion and disgust. I want you gone from this house within the week. You'll go to Charleston and stay there until after the birth. You'll never see the child. You'll never speak of what happened here, and you'll never mention that creature's name again. If you violate any of these terms, I'll have you committed to an asylum for insanity. Do you understand? Catherine nodded. She'd lost everything. But at least she was alive, and so was the child. What about Grace? What about her? Can I see her before I leave? Isaiah's face hardened. Absolutely not. She's already been moved from the property. For all you know, she's dead already, and that's all you'll ever know. But that was a lie. Grace was still in the equipment shed, and she would remain there for another 3 days, while Thomas made arrangements with a slave trader he knew, a man who specialized in handling problem slaves for clients who wanted them to disappear quietly. The tribunal was held on December 18, 1847 in the courthouse in Hanover County after hours, attended by 3 magistrates Thomas had carefully selected for their discretion and financial dependence on the Vanderhorst family. Dr. Kemp provided his report, edited to remove any suggestion that Catherine had knowingly participated in the deception. The story presented was that Grace, a person of ambiguous gender, who had been fraudulently sold as female, had taken advantage of Catherine's innocence and isolation to engage in acts that resulted in pregnancy. Catherine was portrayed as a victim of deception, naive and trusting. Grace was portrayed as a calculating predator who had deliberately infiltrated the household with malicious intent. The tribunal took less than 2 hours to reach its conclusions. Grace was judged guilty of fraud, deception, and assault. The recommended punishment was sailed to a plantation in the deep South under conditions that would ensure she never had contact with white society again. Catherine was absolved of willing participation, but judged to have shown poor judgment in allowing such familiarity with a servant. She was remanded to her husband's custody with the recommendation that she be removed from the situation that had led to her poor judgment. The child's fate was left to Isaiah's discretion with the understanding that it would not be raised at Riverwood or acknowledged as a Vanderhort heir. The next day, December 19th, Grace was removed from the equipment shed and transported to Richmond in chains. Thomas supervised the transfer personally, handing her over to a trader named Samuel Hicks, who operated out of Lumpin's Jail, the notorious slave prison on Richmond's north side. What happened to Grace after that was never officially recorded, but Hicks was known for sending troublesome slaves to the sugar plantations of Louisiana, where life expectancy measured in months rather than years, and where no one asked questions about a worker's past. Catherine left Riverwood on December 21st, traveling to Charleston with only Dinah for company. She was 5 months pregnant, visibly showing despite her traveling clothes. Isaiah didn't come out to say goodbye. He watched from his study window as the carriage pulled away, then turned back to his desk and the bourbon that had become his constant companion since the tribunal. At Constance Vanderhorst's Charleston residence, Catherine was installed in a third-floor room overlooking the harbor. Her mother-in-law received her with cold efficiency, having been told enough by Thomas to understand that Catherine had brought shame to the family. Constance made it clear that Catherine would remain confined until after the birth, and that she should consider herself fortunate Isaiah hadn't simply committed her to an asylum. The winter passed slowly. Catherine spent her days at the window, watching ships come and go, thinking about Grace and wondering if she was still alive somewhere in Louisiana. She knew the sugar plantations were brutal, that workers often died within months of arrival. But she allowed herself to hope that somehow Grace had survived, had perhaps escaped, had found freedom in some northern city where no one knew her story. On April 23, 1848, Catherine went into labor. The birth was attended by a discreet midwife Constance had hired specifically for difficult situations. After 14 hours, Catherine delivered a healthy boy with dark hair and features that could have belonged to either Isaiah or Grace, ambiguous enough that no definitive judgment could be made. Catherine held her son for 2 hours. She memorized his face, counted his fingers and toes, whispered promises she knew she couldn't keep. Then Constance came and took him away. Thomas had arranged for the child to be placed with a farming family in Buckingham County, people who needed help and were willing to raise an infant of uncertain parentage for a sum that would secure their future. The boy would be called William Hutchkins, and he would never know the truth of his origins. Catherine returned to Riverwood in mid-May, a ghost in her own life. Isaiah rarely spoke to her, maintaining separate quarters and interacting only when social propriety demanded it. The household staff, who had witnessed everything, kept their silence with the practiced discretion of those who understood that speaking truth could be fatal. 3 weeks after Catherine's return, a letter arrived from Thomas. It was addressed to Isaiah, but he read portions aloud to Catherine with deliberate cruelty. Samuel Hicks had sent confirmation that Grace had been sold to the Morrison plantation outside New Orleans. The work there was punishing the overseers brutal. Grace had lasted 4 months before dying of what the plantation records listed as exhaustion and fever. Catherine felt something break inside her that never healed. Grace was dead. Their son was gone, and she was trapped in a marriage that had become her prison. She thought seriously about ending her own life that summer, spending long hours walking near the James River, considering how easy it would be to simply walk into the water and let it take her. But she didn't. Something stubborn in her refused to give Isaiah that satisfaction, refused to let the story end with her surrender. So she lived. She managed the household, attended church, performed the duties expected of a Virginia lady. She became known in Hanover County as a quiet woman, somewhat melancholy, devoted to charitable works, but keeping largely to herself. Isaiah died in 1856 of a heart ailment, leaving Riverwood to a distant cousin. Catherine was provided for in the will, but chose not to remain at the plantation. She moved to Richmond, where she lived modestly on her widow's income until her death in 1871. She never remarried, never had other children, and never spoke of what had happened in 1847. The boy, William Hutchkins, grew up never knowing he'd been adopted. He lived an ordinary life as a Virginia farmer, married, had children of his own, and died in 1889, without ever learning about the plantation in Hanover County, or the impossible love story that had brought him into the world. His descendants scattered across the state, carrying forward the genetic legacy of that union, without knowing its source. The tribunal records were sealed by court order, and supposedly destroyed in a courthouse fire during the Civil War, but rumors persisted for decades about copies that survived in private hands. In the 1920s, a historian researching plantation economics found fragments of the story in courthouse archives, but the documents were so deteriorated and incomplete that he couldn't piece together the full narrative. He made cryptic notes about a domestic scandal involving questionable identity and moved on to other research. Dr. Howard Kemp left Virginia in 1849 and never practiced medicine again. According to letters found after his death in 1867, he was haunted by guilt over his role in Grace's fate. Thomas Vanderhorst burned most of his papers before his death in 1873, but a few surviving letters hint at the burden of secrets he carried. Riverwood Plantation was sold to a timber company in 1885. The main house stood empty for years before burning under mysterious circumstances in 1891. Today, nothing remains except foundation stones and a historical marker that mentions the Vanderhorst family's contributions to Virginia's tobacco industry, with no reference to the events of 1847. Grace's story ends in a Louisiana sugar field, her real name unknown, her life reduced to a single line in a plantation ledger. Negro, ambiguous, deceased. Catherine's story ends in a Richmond boarding house, her secrets taken to an unmarked grave. Their son's story ends without him ever knowing the truth of who his parents were, or what they'd sacrificed. The full truth of what happened at Riverwood will probably never be completely known. Too much has been deliberately destroyed. Too many witnesses died without recording testimony. Too many secrets were buried to protect reputations. What remains are fragments, a suspicious bill of sale, sealed medical reports, letters that hint at scandal without providing details, and local legends about the plantation where something terrible happened. But no one remembers exactly what. It's a reminder that history is always incomplete, that the official record reflects only what those in power chose to preserve, and that the most compelling human stories are often the ones someone worked hardest to erase. Grace and Catherine lived, loved, and suffered in a world that denied them both dignity and memory. That their story survives at all, even in fragments, is perhaps a small act of resistance against those who tried to suppress it entirely. What do you think really happened at Riverwood? Do you believe the sealed records told the whole truth, or are there still secrets buried in Virginia archives waiting to be discovered? The reality is that stories like this exist throughout American history, hidden in courthouse basements, whispered in family legends, carefully omitted from official narratives. If this dark chapter from the past fascinated you, and you want more forgotten American mysteries, subscribe to Dark Diaries, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates history's hidden stories. Drop a comment below telling me what state you're from, and whether you know of similar historical mysteries in your region. The past has a way of hiding its most uncomfortable truths, but together, we can bring them back into the light. Until next time, remember, the stories that survive are the ones we refuse to let die. See you in the next video.